Well, hello and welcome to our replacement video for the third and final session we are doing on the book of Proverbs. We are going to be doing a little bit more by way of thematic studies in the Proverbs, and then we're going to touch on chapters 30 and 31. Without further ado, let's jump in where we left off last time. We left off talking about the theme of the tongue. Our intention is to complete this kind of negative section on this negative study, how not to use your tongue, and then we'll do one more thematic study, a positive study on how to use your tongue. And of course, in the therefore time that we've been able to spend on this subject, we've covered 3 topics. There are many more topics that you'll discover in that kind of heart of the Proverbs message 10 through 29, where you're getting that typical proverb structure of the different things covered without runs or flows of context. But anyway, let's talk about how not to use your tongue. We left off with the idea of untimely speech. I believe we touched on the first couple of these things. So we'll pick up with this thought as relates to untimely speech, in light of the principle that the Proverbs are going to have us saying less, thinking more. Then we would do well to, first of all, listen before we speak. Remember this being left up, but I can't remember if we covered it or not. So Proverbs 18:13, he who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. We need to listen and not just answer a matter without hearing that matter first. And then, therefore, also we need to not just listen, but we need to think before we speak. Proverbs 15 and verse 28, it reads, the heart of the righteous studies how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil. And so a careful, considerate answer is what should stem out of the tongue of the person who has given himself to wisdom. The mouth of the wicked simply, spouts off. It is like a tap that's been turned on and doesn't have the capability of being turned off. And so as God's people, we should strive, obviously, to be righteous and to be controlled in our speech, to think before we speak. Then also, number 3, we would do well to soften our speech. Chapter 15 and verse 1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And so we have the capability of preventing anger. We know that anger can lead to sin, and we know that causing others to sin is, according to Jesus, something that we should be willing to have a stone hung around our neck and cast into the sea rather than doing. We don't want to lead other people to sin. And so as a consequence, let's learn to soften our speech. And then next, not everything, as we think about the untimely nature of speech at times, not everything that is seen or heard needs to be said. So Proverbs chapter 11 and verse number 13 says, a talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter. And faithful here, you see several times in Scripture, not having reference necessarily to a person who believes in God, although these are, the positive side of these things are typically things that godly people are going to be concerned with. A trustworthy spirit is the idea of the term faithful here. But again, to get the thought, a trustworthy spirit is a person who knows how to conceal what ought not be told. And just think about that before you speak. Think about whether or not people need to hear this information. Typically, if we're talking about someone else, are we working together with that person to help that person that we are about to talk about? And if not, then it's probably not something that we need to be talking about. But number 2, in terms of how not to use your tongue, we've got untimely speech. Number 2, untoward speech. Untoward isn't a word we use. I've kept it for the sake of alliteration, not a word that we normally use, but the word untoward means not fitting or not proper. And so what is untoward speech? What is not right or proper as relates to what we say? Evil speech comes of evil and leads to evil. Proverbs chapter 17 and verse number 20. He who has a deceitful heart finds no good, and he who has a perverse tongue falls into evil. Notice the deceitful heart, and that's where the speech comes from. And then notice the perverse tongue, obviously being connected with that heart. You will say what's on your heart. The heart is the wellspring of life. Out of the heart, the abundances of life issue, and so both our behavior and our speech come out of our heart. And so we will say the wrong thing if we have an evil heart, and the result of those things, according to verse number 20, is evil. That person will fall into evil. So all those lessons that the Proverbs teach then about guarding your heart are very important. We're going to guard our tongue. Untoward speech, as identified by the Proverbs, includes the following. It includes prideful speech. Chapter 14 and verse 13 says, even in laughter the heart may sorrow, and the end of mirth may be grief. Now, that's not right. Oh, 14, I was reading 14:13. It says for 14:3. I can read my own notes. But 14:3, in the mouth of a fool is a rod of pride, but the lips of the wise will preserve them. And you say, well, it almost seems like pride is a weapon there, but a weapon for what purpose? The recipient of that rod of pride is going to be none other than the fool himself. He will be beaten by his words. But instead of being beaten, the lips of the wise will actually protect and preserve them. And so prideful speech is the opposite of what comes out of the lips of the wise. Flattering speech is also something that is untoward, according to the Proverbs, chapter 29 and verse number 5. Chapter 29 and verse number 5 reads, a man who flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. You are entrapping yourself by engaging in the practice of flattery. So if you say something, mean it, is the simple lesson here. We can compliment people, and we should actually compliment people, encourage them, but that doesn't mean that we should say things that are ingenuine. That is either discovered by the person to whom we say those things, or it is observed by others and we lose credibility in their sight. Number 3, backbiting is something that is untoward as regards the Proverbs. Proverbs 25 and verse 23. Proverbs 25 and verse 23. The north wind brings forth rain, and a backbiting tongue an angry countenance. As you know, this is in the biblical world. The north wind typically would bring rain. It's typical that someone is going to end up angry when we engage in the practice of backbiting, when we engage in the practice of saying things behind the back of others. Someone is going to get angry. May even be the person that we are speaking to. You know, sometimes people will get angry at us for trying to tear down someone that they, perhaps hold dear. So again, we don't want to get into the habit of speaking negatively about people when we are not in their presence, and really not even ever get into the habit of speaking negatively about people unless it's absolutely necessary. There are times, when you think about the New Testament message, Romans 16:17, the need to, I believe that's the reference anyway, but in Romans 16, the need to mark and avoid certain individuals because of their divisive nature. You're going to have to at times spread negative information about people to carry out that commandment, but your aim is not to hurt that person. Your aim is instead to keep, those people that you are sharing that marking to from being hurt, and ultimately to create an environment where that person is held accountable to the idea of change. And so again, positivity is what is the aim, rather than just tearing someone down. Gossiping, which backbiting and gossiping are perhaps synonyms of each other. Backbiting has the aim of tearing others down. Gossiping perhaps has maybe a different aim. It can be recreational for some people. They just love to hear and tell. But the Proverbs again would have us being faithful and concealing. Proverbs chapter 26 and verse 20 says, where there is no wood, the fire goes out. Where there is no talebearer, strife ceases. Verse 22, the words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles. They go down into the innermost body. So we need to be aware of both the danger of talebearing, the danger of gossiping, and then also how addictive gossiping can be. There's some people, like I said, just love to engage in this practice. They don't mean any harm by it, but they are causing harm, and they should stop. Quarrelsome speech is also untoward speech in the Proverbs, chapter 26 and verse 21. In the midst of that, we have a little bit of a contextual flow here in chapter 26 verses 20 through 22. Well, actually, it goes a little bit further than that in the context. But anyway, as relates to speech, verse 21, as charcoal is to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. And so a person who has, a contentious attitude has a way of kindling or bringing about strife. And given the sandwich, so to speak, is about speech, I tend to think that this references quarrelsome speech. So, continuing this thought, some simple ways to avoid speaking in an untoward way would be when we speak, have a godly reason for it. We need to think, obviously, pause before we speak. So let's make sure that when we do so, we are evaluating the benefit of what we are about to say, and not just the benefit in terms of how it will make us feel or how we will be seen in the eyes of the person that we're speaking to, because maybe we're using someone else as our stool to lift ourselves higher. We're standing upon them to build ourselves up. No, it's not how we look. It's not how anyone looks. It's about what's going to be for everyone's eternal good. And then number two, speak only what is pure, powerful, positive, and peaceful. So we don't want to be engaging in contention. We don't want to be engaging in lying about others. We want to build each other up in a positive, edifying way. So powerful speech and then positive speech. Number three, though, so we've seen untimely speech, untoward speech. But then number three, the Proverbs would have us avoid untrue speech. Those who seek to practice the Proverbs simply must tell the truth. Chapter 12 and verse 17. Chapter 12 and verse 17, he who speaks truth declares righteousness, but a false witness, deceit. And so we declare righteousness. Obviously, truth and righteousness go hand in hand. But we also declare our righteousness. It's not just the content of what we are saying, it's the content of our character, effectively. The false witness shows not just a lie with his speech, but a deceitful disposition that is contrary to righteousness. Verse 22, we might as well read that since we have that open here. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who deal truthfully are his delight. And so we want to be the delight, those who bring the Lord delight, right? I mean, that's the aim of the walk, to serve God. And so let's tell the truth. Untruths place our souls at stake. Chapter 18 and verse number 6. A fool's lips enter into contention, and his mouth calls for blows. A fool's mouth is his destruction, and his lips are the snare of his soul. The words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles; they go down to the innermost body. And so again, maybe you see that thought proverbially restated. And by the way, that happens in the Proverbs. There are thoughts that are restated, either maybe for contextual emphasis or because of the nature of the Proverbs, we're getting little thought bites to think about. And we need to think about some things more than once. But the point is, again, that we're telling things that aren't true, sharing things that aren't true, and gossiping, or just in spreading out information. Those things bring about our destruction and entrap our souls. Untruths can place the souls of those who hear us also at stake. Chapter 14 and verse 25, a true witness delivers souls, but a deceitful witness speaks lies. And so again, deliverance comes through those who tell the truth. But and if the word deliver is put in contrast here, you have to believe that deceitfulness will do the opposite of that. Just checking the marginal reading here, because I saw there was a note in the New King James here. It says that a true witness actually saves lives. And deliverance of soul and life. Untruths can take different shapes and sizes. Besides the obvious lie, hypocrisy is untrue and should be avoided according to the Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 9 reads, "The hypocrite with his mouth destroys his neighbor, but through knowledge the righteous will be delivered." So there is a personal preservation that's possible, but also getting those thoughts, set in antithesis to each other. It stands to reason that we would also be able to deliver our neighbor through behaving in a way consistent with knowledge. And what we share through our speech and through our example has an impact upon others. Hypocrisy is not righteous nor true. Chapter 26 and verse 24. He who hates disguises it with his lips and lays up deceit within himself. When he speaks kindly, do not believe him, for there are 7 abominations within his heart. So again, especially totally corrupt is the nature of a person who chooses to be hypocritical. Inconsistency is also untrue. Chapter 19 and verse 22. And again, there's not a great deal of difference between hypocrisy and inconsistency, but a different way of thinking about this proverbially. What is desired in a man is kindness, and a poor man is better than a liar. And so, we want to be consistent and not resort to lying. It'd be better to be poor and to be kind. Understatement and half-truths are also untrue from the standpoint of the Proverbs, chapter 20 and verse 14. "It is good for nothing," cries the buyer, "but when he is gone his way, then he boasts." Obviously, we don't want to go to the market and then downplay the value of something that we are trying to buy in the hopes of getting a better deal. It's just when you think about that whole mentality of me getting a better deal. There's nothing wrong with trying to get a deal, but it should be that when a Christian engages in a business transaction, both parties leave satisfied. We don't want to tear down what someone else has just for the sake of giving them less, and therefore not only do we get what we want, but we also get what else we want, right? And paying less money. It's not a Christian way of going about business, and it's not how we should use our speech. Whatever is gained through telling untruth is simply not worth it. There's a lot of Proverbs that touch on that idea. Chapter 21 and verse 6 we'll focus on. It says, "Getting treasures by a lying tongue is the fleeting fantasy of those who seek death." Wow, that's a very, very powerful and pointed statement along those lines. So it's just not worth it to tell a lie to get something that we want. So to avoid speaking untruths, what do we need to do? We need to find good scales and use them consistently. What do we mean by that? Well, there's a sort of proverb on display a number of times about these inconsistent scales, dishonest scales. Chapter 11 and verse 1, "Dishonest scales are an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight." Now, I know that has to do with business endeavors and selling things and that kind of thing, and using the right weight measurements and so on. But by extension, we want to measure things properly and say what is true. We want things to line up, and that's in our behavior, that's in what we sell, but of course it's also in what we say. And so maybe you can turn that kind of thought into a sort of proverb, which is what we're meant to do. We're meant to think about the proverb and then peel back the layers of the onion, reflect upon other ways that we can, unpack those truths. We need, number 2, if we're going to avoid untrue speech, we need to be careful who or what we listen to. Chapter 17 and verse number 4, "An evildoer gives heed to false lips, and a liar listens eagerly to a spiteful tongue." So we will do wrong and speak wrong when we listen to those who are doing those things, speaking and doing wrong. Right, so we just need to be careful. 1 Corinthians 15:33 admonition comes to the mind of Christian hearers of this text. Evil companions will corrupt our good morals. Be careful, number 3, how far we allow a problem to spread. Chapter 25 and verse number 9. Chapter 25 and verse number 9. Debate your cause with your neighbor, and do not disclose the secret to another, lest he who hears it expose your shame and your reputation be ruined. So again, the problems should be dealt with, so to speak, in-house. I know this is with the neighbor, so it's not in-house as such, but we don't want this issues to be spread out, because sometimes we spread out an issue thinking we're in the right, and others maybe see that we're actually in the wrong. So let's just try to handle it on the smallest scale possible. You can think about Jesus in Matthew 18, touching on when there's an issue between you and a brother, to whom are you to go? That brother. And if you can work out the matter with just him, then what does Jesus say? Well, you've gained your brother. And so other people should only be involved when that isn't the outcome of that conversation, or when that kind of resolution isn't possible, but you've tried it. Number 4, to avoid speaking untruths, we must give careful thought before we promise, and then deliver when we do promise. Chapter 25 and verse number 14. Whoever falsely boasts of giving is like clouds and winds without rain. In places where there is desert and famine, clouds that do not give rain are incredibly frustrating. And you just long for them to deliver on the potential that they seem to be declaring. We don't want to be the cloud without rain to someone else in our lives. And then number 5, to avoid speaking untruths, we must tell the truth no matter what. Proverbs 14 and verse number 5, a faithful witness does not lie, but a false witness will utter lies. And so again, we've seen this before, but we want to tell the truth and not be a false witness, but a faithful one. Now, let's quickly transition gears into this next topic, how to use your tongue positively, right? This next theme of study. So pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul, health to the bones. It's almost one of those times where you say, I didn't need the Proverbs to tell me that. Well, whenever that happens, whenever we see something so obvious and straightforward, let's think about it proverbially. And again, reflect upon what this text then is calling us to do. If these things are like a honeycomb to me, if they are sweetness to my soul and health to my bones, then if I'm practicing the golden rule as a Christian and doing unto others as I would have them do unto me, I'm going to allow this proverb to prompt me to make a decision to be principled about the way I use my tongue, and speak words that are going to be sweet and saving to those that are around me. So let's talk about 3 things that we can gather from the Proverbs as to how we are to use our tongue in a positive way. So let's talk about the opportunities of the tongue, first of all. The tongue brings a great gain in potential to those who use it properly. You can speak about the tongue as a raging fire from the standpoint of James, or you can speak about it in terms of a rudder or a bridle. It's brings something big and powerful under control, and produces good. People utilize boats because of their good. They utilize horses because of their good, and the tongue can be the vehicle for bringing about good for you and others, as we're going to see. But first for you, so it can bring 2 things: sustenance, first of all, in Proverbs 18 and verse number 20 is the one we're going to highlight from this. A man's stomach shall be satisfied from the fruit of his mouth, from the produce of his lips he shall be filled. And so your tongue is a way of bringing bringing about providential care for yourself, and bringing good things into your life, but then also value into your life. Chapter 20 and verse 15, there is gold in a multitude of rubies, but the lips of knowledge are a precious jewel. And so one of the riches that you can have is a tongue properly trained. So it brings gain in terms of sustenance and value to you, but here's the thing, it also brings it to others. And that kind of popped right up here, but let's go to Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 11. Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 11. The mouth of the righteous is a well of life, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. And the person who is righteous can be that well of life in his speech towards those who are around him. So sustenance, and then also value. Verse 20: the tongue of the righteous is choice silver, the heart of the wicked is worth little. And so that's obviously the estimation of those looking on to this. And so there's a I've heard of a silver-tongued speaker before, but that's only what belongs to a righteous person. All right, so I can see all of my animations are not going to be working well, but you're all right. You guys are hopefully going to be able to follow these along without them be putting them up one at a time. So I won't stop the video and fix that, even though I really want to. A tongue can do several things by way of its opportunities, and so it can save us from trouble. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 13: the wicked is ensnared by the transgression of his lips, but the righteous will come through trouble. Rather than being entrapped, we will be brought through. It can lift up a soul that's in sorrow or need. Chapter 12 and verse 25: anxiety in the heart of a man causes depression, but a good word makes it glad. It can also bring us friends. Chapter 24 and verse 26. 24 and verse 26 reads: he who gives a right answer kisses the lips. You say, well, I don't want somebody to kiss the lips, but that's a salutation of blessing, common in the Eastern world, and or at least the Middle Eastern world. And again, a positive thing. And then also a tongue can surmount great obstacles. Chapter 25 and verse 15: by long forbearance a ruler is persuaded, and a gentle tongue breaks a bone. Now, obviously, the first part of that proverb doesn't have to do with speech, but rather than forceful effort, trying to persuade a ruler, actually, that does. I said it doesn't do with speech, but rather than kind of coming in and forcing your way, you can use a gentle tongue to overcome something that's very hard. And so just a soft application over and over again. And so you may say, well, I don't want to try to overcome a ruler, but maybe you want to overcome someone who has the intimidating power, or even the real power of a ruler. Well, again, a tongue can slowly overcome great obstacles. So let's see. Just looking at how all these are going to be animated, and I think it's just going to be the first thing that pops up each time. But anyway, the opportunities of the tongue. The reality is that there are, like what we've seen in many other ways in the Proverbs and in the rest of Scripture, there's really only two opportunities. The tongue can destroy us, or the tongue can deliver us. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse number 21: death and life are in the power of the tongue. Those who love it will eat its fruit. Those who show an appropriate level of care and value as relates to their tongue are going to be fed by it. We've already seen the sustaining power of the tongue, but really it's more than just sustenance that's on offer, or at risk of being lost. It's death and life itself. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. So with those opportunities, our second major thought here in how to use our tongue will be the idea of really obligation. There's an obligation of the tongue. The tongue has an obligation to speak purely rather than to think wickedly. And I like the way these two things are put into contrast with each other. Chapter 15 and verse 26 reads: the thoughts of the wicked are an abomination to the Lord, but the words of the pure are pleasant. Now think about those two lines being put in antithesis to each other. The thoughts of the wicked, you don't have anything about their speech there. We know from other Proverbs that what we think ends up coming out of our tongue eventually, but that's not what the Proverbs are calling us to think about. It's calling us to think about the thoughts of the wicked, and then the words of the pure are pleasant. Of course, pleasant to the Lord would be the continuance of that thought. But again, reflecting on those two things being put into antithesis. Someone, one of our, let me just say this different ways. One of our common sayings is, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Well, the Proverbs would actually have us, rather than stew on the thing that we ought not say, it would have us try to find a way to think what is good and then to say what is good. And again, if there's an issue, it's good at times to talk about that issue, but then as we do so, how are we going to do so? With a gentle tongue, with tact in our speech rather than untimely speech. And we'll talk about tactfulness in speech in just a minute. But again, you have really this obligation of not keeping the evil in you or keeping the good in you, but rather speaking what is good. In order to speak purely, though, the tongue, from the standpoint of the Proverbs, has to be taught. Your default setting from the standpoint of the Proverbs when you're born is that you're a fool, and you have to be taught. Well, so it is with your tongue as well. Chapter 10, verse 13. Wisdom is found on the lips of him who has understanding, but a rod is for the back of him who is devoid of understanding. And so nothing about speech in that second line, but again, that the implication is that again, you'll say things that are wrong when you do not apply yourself to wisdom. And so what do you have to do to get wisdom? Verse 14, to perhaps form a little bit of a contextual link. Wise people store up knowledge. The mouth of the foolish is near destruction. All right, so we have to teach and store up knowledge so that we can say what is ultimately what is right. So a tongue has an obligation to put its knowledge then to use. It's not enough just simply to learn, but we've already seen the need to speak. And so we need to put our knowledge to use by exercising and spreading it. Chapter 15 and verse 2, first of all. Chapter 15 and verse number 2. The answer of the wise uses knowledge rightly, but the mouth of fools pours forth foolishness. And so the person who is wise doesn't just spout forth what is foolish. He is a person who is going to use his knowledge rightly and pour forth what is wise. But then spreading is a part of that. And so again, chapter 15 and verse 7, you can go back to that thought in the chapter here. The lips of the wise disperse knowledge. The heart of the fool does not do so. Then chapter 10 and verse 31, the mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom. The perverse tongue will be cut out. Wow. So you don't want to have your tongue cut out. Use it wisely. Spread knowledge. In exercising and spreading knowledge, the tongue further has these obligations. It has the obligation, one, to speak what is right. Chapter 23 and verse 16. Chapter 23 and verse 16 says, yes, my inmost being will rejoice when your lips speak right things. This is in the context of a father speaking to his son all of a sudden here in the midst of other proverbial statements. But still, like that father, we will find that there is rejoicing when others speak right things, and we want to bring that about for others. So then to speak what is right, but then also to heal. Chapter 15 and verse number 4. Chapter 15 and verse number 4. A wholesome tongue is a tree of life. Perverseness in it breaks the spirit. We want to be a tree of life and be healthy, wholesome, sound in what we say. Marginal reading there says not just wholesome, but healing. And so we have an obligation to heal. But then number 3, to feed. Chapter 10 and verse 21, the lips of the righteous feed many. Fools die for lack of wisdom. So we don't want to leave the fools out there without the opportunity. One of the saddest hymns that we sing is "You Never Mentioned Him to Me." And so there are people who are starving, waiting for us to mention the teaching of God and the teaching of wisdom. Number 4, we have an obligation to deliver through our speech. Chapter 14 and verse number 5, faithful witness does not lie, but a false witness will utter lies. And so we've visited that a few times, but then also chapter 12 and verse number 6, the thoughts of the righteous are right, the counsels of the wicked are deceitful. So we can deliver and offer good guidance to people by the manner of our speech. Number 3, though, we've thought about the opportunities and then the obligations of the tongue. Let's think about the ornaments of the tongue. So in terms of the ornaments of the tongue, there are 2 that we'll touch on from the standpoint of the Proverbs. Tenderness is an ornament of the tongue, chapter 15 and verse 1, which we've reflected upon this before. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And so we want to have soft answers instead of harsh answers. Chapter 16 and verse 21, the wise in heart will be called prudent, and sweetness of the lips increases learning. People are more likely to hear you when you are sweet in your speech. Then number 2, tact and timeliness are also ornaments of the tongue. Right there in chapter 15, verse 23, the heart of the wise teaches his mouth and adds learning to his lips. We've seen that previously. Chapter 23 and verse number 9 says, do not speak in the hearing of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of your words. Now you can say, yeah, that's true, but then what's the lesson for me? Because the Proverbs aren't going to just simply have us evaluating others, right? So I don't want to be a person that people are avoiding speaking around because I'm a fool. I want to be a person who's known for a person who wants to learn and wants to grow. Tenderness, tact, timeliness, and teaching as a product is necessary to bring that about many times. I'll leave it to your discretion to, again, explore some of the other scripture references that we've had. And we've kind of breezed through these, but we'll go ahead and I will go ahead and take a little break from my recording. And then we will return and we will touch on chapters 30 and 31. Okay, we're back and continuing our recording for makeup for our Proverbs class. We're picking up with Proverbs chapter 30 and going to be discussing the wise words of Agur. Who is Agur? Well, if you have that question, don't expect an answer anytime soon. We will introduce the text and do what we can to introduce him, although we just don't know very much. And so introduction is really given to us by the first 6 verses. There's a definite kind of set up for what's going to be the main body of teaching. And it starts off with, of course, identifying this text as the product of one who is called Agur. Chapter 30 and verse number 1, the words of Agur, the son of Jakeh, his utterance. This man declared to Ithiel and Ukal. Now, the speaker, of course, is Agur, the son of Jakeh. Do we know who this is? No, we have actually no information about him from the rest of Scripture, no person that we can tie him to. It's not as though this is some kind of a nickname. It's very clear that this is a name of a father, or rather a son, and his father's named. And so there's just no one that we can line it up with, either him or his father. He is given a message. Now, it is described in the text as an utterance that typically signifies an inspired message, and so message that's come from God. And, obviously these are some deeply personal reflections, but they also demonstrate a great deal of wisdom. And, we'll speculate as to whether he had this wisdom and God brought inspiration to him, or God granted him this wisdom through inspiration. But utterance probably points to this being an inspired message. The audience, Ithiel and Ukal, we know nothing about them either. And is this an audience, or are these words meant to mean something else? And you wonder sometimes, what do we do with some of these words that are left untranslated at times, and are they just names? Could be. So you don't get the sense that he's talking to sons or anything like that in the text, and so we just don't really know a lot, other than what the text directly tells us. The text, as I've said, it does reflect some observation and thinking on the part of Agur. And so, again, that question of whether this is inspired or whether or not this is actually his reflections that he has simply, well, not whether or not it's inspired. Let me say that again properly, the way I said it the first time, whether or not he discovered this and God brought inspiration to it, or whether or not this was all information given him by inspiration. Major life lessons are going to be grouped by 3 yes 4, 3 yes 4. And so just just kind of look for that structure, and that kind of paves the way for a new topic of discussion. Again, inspiration either led Agur to humility or came to him after he found it. He makes some sweeping statements here. He realizes what he knew, or more importantly, what he didn't know. Verse 2, surely I am more stupid than any man and do not have the understanding of a man. Now, obviously, what we see on display here is not a display of stupidity, but he's mirroring what sometimes people say about education. The more that I learn, the more I realize I don't know. I think that's probably to the point of what he's trying to say in a very blunt way. And maybe there's a lesson in humility there for us. We don't want to call others fools. Jesus told us not to do that. But at times, realizing our own vast limitations is a good exercise. And so he says, I neither learned wisdom nor have the knowledge of the Holy One. God clearly knows more than me, and that's really where we need to stand. I don't know that we need to claim foolishness at all times, but foolishness as relates in comparison to God, that's a good thing to own. Verse 4, he realized who he wasn't. In verse 4, who has ascended into heaven or descended? That's an interesting question. It's a thought that's visited in the Psalms and revisited later by Paul, and that is God himself, or God in the person of Jesus has done that. Who has gathered the wind in his fists? God. Who has bound the waters in a garment? God. Who has established all the ends of the earth? God. What is his name, and what is his son's name, if you know? Well, I think that he's not affirming the Son of God there as much as he's saying, is this any person? And the rhetorical question is no. Rather, it has a no answer, I should say. And so he's not God. Man is not God. No one meets these qualifications but God. Having realized these things, then he realizes where wisdom is and what has to be done with it. In verse 5, every word of God is pure. He is a shield to those who put their trust in him. So we should receive that message and receive it in its purity and place our trust in it. But what must we not do? Well, in verse 6, do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. This forms one of 3 very strong textual reminders of the integrity of the text, or what should be treated as the text's integrity. Remember Deuteronomy, just lost the scripture reference in my mind. But in Deuteronomy, nonetheless, you can search it, and that's a moment in humility for me not to stop and find the reference and then give it to you. But in Deuteronomy, Moses encourages us not to add to or take away from the commandments of the law, because in so doing, we will fail to keep them. And then, of course, in Revelation 22, 18, and 19, the instruction given there to not add to or take away from the words of the book of the prophecy. So you have, 2 bookends and 1 bookmark. I sometimes call them of textual reminders to avoid adding to or taking away from the Word of God. And again, the reason attached to that here is we will be found to be liars when we change or alter God's message. God will be true, as Paul said in Romans 3, and every man will be a liar. So let's talk about Agur's prayer that proceeds forth from this realization of humility. And this is before we get into the major kind of meat of his message. Chapter 30 and verse 7, he says, 2 things I request of you, deprive me not before I die. Remove falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food allotted to me, lest I be full and deny you and say, who is the Lord? Or lest I be poor and steal and profane the name of my God. As you're thinking about these 2 things that Agur desires, first of all, he wants no lies in his life, as it says in the first part of verse 8, remove falsehood and lies far from me. He wants nothing but the truth of God's will to characterize his knowledge. And so Keep lies from me, he says. The number two, he says, I want to neither be poor nor rich. And so he wants to strike the middle in his society, whatever that might be. Realize a couple of things along those lines. One, a person who is entrenched in the middle of the middle class in the United States and Australia and New Zealand is a person who is rich. So let's not play games with that idea. We face great temptations in these nations of prosperity, and we have to be aware of those temptations and have to be aware of the obligation that we have to use our wealth as a tool for righteousness rather than allowing it to become a tool for Satan for our undoing. And so, really, if we were to have Agar's prayer would be to have enough to live on and not to have any more than that and not to have any less than that. You can envision the person who finds himself living effectively from paycheck to paycheck, but always meeting his obligations and having enough for the moment. That's really the person who's living the life that Agar envisions as a blessed one. Why does he want that to be the case? Well, because he knows that if you have too much, you will effectively not want the Lord, not care for the Lord's influence in your life. If you have too little, you'll be tempted to compromise in some way. He talks about stealing, but we can think about that proverbially and say there are any number of ways that people are tempted when they have too little. And, I've encountered before Christians who give in to the temptation to, work at all costs. And, even if it means never coming to assemble with the saints, they say, well, I've got to pay the bills. And I try to remind myself and as many people as I possibly can, we don't have to do anything in life but serve God. So fall out of the habit of saying, I have to, as relates to anything but your moral obligations. Okay. So anyway, let's go on to his observations. And again, they're structured by these 3 yes, 4 messages. So the first of these doesn't come immediately in the text. It actually comes at the conclusion of what's clearly a set of teaching. And so we have some teaching on some shameless self-seekers. Verse 10, do not malign a servant to his master, lest he curse you and you be found guilty. Again, a person who would try to become a judge of someone else's servant in the aim of getting himself into a higher position, a self-seeker in that way would be condemned. The inspired text later, of course, is going to say, who are you to judge another, through James and others in the New Testament, right? So again, don't be trying to bring judgment as though you are master when you are not. But continuing along with that line of thinking in a more direct teaching way, there is a generation that curses its father and mother and does not bless, or rather, its father and does not bless its mother. There's a generation that is pure in its own eyes. There's a generation of how lofty are their eyelids. There's a generation whose teeth are like swords, and so on. I find that congregationally speaking, if you ask which generation this is, most people will say the one immediately after them. The baby boomers will say, maybe not the one immediately after them. Sometimes it's the one that's after that one, so the baby boomers will say the millennials, and of course the millennials might say the Gen Z. No, that's the one right after them. But anyway, everybody says the generation that comes after. Nobody wants to claim that. And maybe the reason that these words are found is, one, to call us to avoid that kind of behavior, 2, to lament that kind of behavior, 3, to do our part to bring about a different kind of generation, both in the way that we structure our lives and our speech and the way that we, guide our children to speak. Now, the self-seeking generation paves the way for the self-seeking creature. In verse 15, the leech has 2 daughters, give. And so that's kind of a standalone statement, but it's a warning. I don't want to be a leech in life. And if I find myself ever being always structured around people giving to me rather than, as Jesus said, it's more blessed to give than to receive. Then I have lived poorly, right? So the three things that are, yes, four that kind of conclude this set of different kind of teachings, but that are all talking about these shameless self-seekers. It says, three things that are never satisfied, four never say enough: the grave, the barren womb, the earth that is not satisfied with water, and the fire never says enough. So the grave never has enough dead people. The barren womb, this is obviously living in a world in which, children were a very, very desirable thing. We today have women who delight in having barren wombs, unfortunately, and some who even will practice abortion in order to achieve such. But in the world of the Bible, children were much more a popular thing and a part of the expectation of what life was supposed to hold for people. You can only look at Rachel and Leah arguing with each other, or Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel chapter 1, and just the way that people really wanted to have children in those days. And so the womb wants children, the grave wants dead people, the earth always soaks up water, continually soaks up water. The fire never says enough. What's the lesson with a list like this? You have these observations. It comes at the close of really the lesson that it's trying to teach. Again, don't be a shameless self-seeker. Now, that lesson is it's almost as though Agur, by inspiration, of course, but again, through his pen, it's almost as though he's trying to prepare us to start making or rather taking the lesson from these observations, right? So we have these observations that kind of lead up to the four that kind of tie with it. But going forward from here, it's almost as though it's like, now you go. Now you make the observation. You draw the conclusion. You make the lesson. First lesson, again, draw from all of that. Again, thinking about all these things negatively, let's think about it positively and say, let's practice self-control. But let's now try our own hand at this without kind of Agur holding our hand, so to speak. So the next three, A4, relates to unseen forces at work. Actually, we didn't talk about verse 17. The eye that mocks his father scorns obedience to his mother. The ravens of the valley will pluck it out, and the eagles will eat the young eagles will eat it. Sorry, that does tie with the previous thought. And again, we don't want to be a person who is not respectful to parents. But that Agur holding our hand, let's go forward here. And verse 18, there are three things which are too wonderful for me, yea, four which I do not understand: the way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a virgin. Now, there's a little bit of hand holding that will go on in verse 20 to kind of show the point of all of this. But what's the commonality between all of these things? Well, we talked about this when we were introducing the Proverbs. We did touch on this text, and so if you remember, bring it to your memory, and if not, I'll remind you. The thing that unites all of these four things is that they are guided by unseen forces. Eagles fly on thermals. Serpents, through subtle changes in their skin and in their muscle structure, are able to move. They don't have legs that you can see scurrying along or anything like that. The ship moves via a rudder. And then there's an unseen force that kind of promotes love between a man and a woman. Well, this is the way. These unseen forces at work is also the way of the adulterous woman. She eats and wipes her mouth and says, I've done no wickedness. Before you know it, you've become the meal of someone who is a sexual predator. And so the lesson of this is going to be to practice self-control, to be more aware of yourself in situations and not allow yourself to be carried along, particularly by someone who could potentially be a romantic interest to you that shouldn't be. So from the standpoint of the Proverbs, remember your cistern is your wife or your spouse if you are obviously a woman, and therefore there's one God-given place for you to find fulfillment. in terms of romance and in terms of love, and don't go anywhere else, and practice control as relates to everything else. Number three, some things that seem out of place in verse 21. So for three things the earth is perturbed, yes, for four it cannot bear up: a servant when he reigns, a fool when he is filled with food, a hateful woman when she is married, and a maidservant who succeeds her mistress. Now, you might wonder about some of these things. Why do we want to, why ought a servant not to reign? It's not about a person improving himself and becoming a king or a leader of some kind. It's about a person who does not do so and then find himself in the leadership position. A fool ought not be able to provide himself with food. A person who is odious in behavior ought not find someone to marry. And then a maidservant, again, like the first line, ought not be a person who is elevated unduly. And so the lesson really, as you think about these three observations, because there's no guided lesson here, the lesson seems to be that we need to practice self-improvement. If we want to reign, be filled with food, wind up being married, and hold the position of the woman of the house, so to speak, or the mistress, then we need to be people who don't behave as servants, don't behave as fools, don't behave in a hateful way, and don't behave as maidservants. Now, that's not about the Christian ideal of loving through service. We are to be servants of our fellow man. Don't get me wrong, but we are to, even in service, exercise leadership. Right? We are to be servant leaders, so to speak, and not wait to be told what to do, but simply to do it out of love and responsibility for the task. And so the call of the text again, I think, is to practice self-improvement, to put ourselves in the right kind of positions in life. And don't look at these and think that again, the Proverbs are trying to uphold a class structure or trying to deny the idea of social mobility. That's not what the Bible's about. You have to take a passage like this and find a meaning that is going to fit the overall message. The message is not about not being a servant. The message is not about all servants are fools. It's a picture of things that are not typically going to happen, and then you see that picture and you say, aha, I want to be a person who improves myself so that I can get the best possible outcomes for myself now and, of course, ultimately in eternity. The next reading here is a passage which talks about wise efforts. Verse 24, there are four things which are little on the earth, but they are exceedingly wise. The ants are a people not strong, yet they prepare food in the summer. Rock badgers are a feeble folk, yet they make their homes in crags. The locusts have no kings, yet they advance in ranks. The spider skillfully grasps with its hands and is in kings' palaces. And so the one that kind of, you have both dwelling places, or two that talk about dwelling places and two that kind of talk about food. But these are creatures which behave wisely and put themselves in wise positions. The spider that gets tucked away in a corner of a tall ceiling is less likely to be killed than a spider that's in a more obvious place. And therefore, spider in a king's palace, the locusts all working together, the rock badgers being weak, finding their home in the rocks and those kind of things. And so wise efforts in the animal kingdom. The lesson then would be to maybe apply myself with the same kind of diligence in my work, put myself in wise places and provide for myself when the opportunity presents itself, to work hard like the ants do and to work together like the locusts do. So wise work and diligent work. Next, 4 list has to do with majesty and might. In verse 29, there are 3 things which are majestic in pace, yes, 4 which are stately in walk. A lion which is mighty among beasts and does not turn away from any, a greyhound, a male goat also, and a king whose troops are with him. You see these regal creatures and, lion's the king of the jungle. The greyhound is the fastest of the dogs. The male goat finds its way to the highest places on the rocks, and a king marching along with his army. Lesson from this is actually interesting because once again, I got ahead of myself by putting that up there. Is interesting because the picture now, Agur returns and offers a little bit of commentary on what he wants us to think about here. Verse 32, if you have been foolish in exalting yourself, or you have devised evil, put your hand on your mouth. So what would be the point of those four things for us? It would be, you are not the king of the jungle. You are not the fastest dog on the track, so to speak. You are not the goat living in solitary places. You are not a king with his troops. Instead, if you have put yourself in your own eyes in one of those kind of places, cover your mouth, because for all of your effort, you might be placing your effort might be pointed in the wrong direction. As the churning of milk produces butter, so effort can be used in a good, positive way. The wringing of nose produces blood. So one, a positive picture of effort, but two, a negative picture of effort. And so the forcing of wrath produces strife. So by all means, do what the texts are pointing you to. Be practicing a person who practices self-control, a person who practices self-improvement, and all of those things we've talked about. But at the end of the day, admit wrong when it arises. Don't force your way, and miss out on the positive work that you have done. All right, so chapter 30. Again, having to breeze through some of these, and I'd love to spend more time here, but hopefully you can gain something from all of that. Well, let's move on to chapter 31 and talk about now from a mother to her son. We've talked previously about a father to his son in chapters 1 through 9. It's interesting how Proverbs closes out with a mother talking to her son. Now, it's still written by a son, or rather a man, because it's the son who writes this lesson rather than the mother writing to her son. So, new speaker, new message. You find in verse 1 the words of King Lemuel, the utterance which his mother taught him. The author is Lemuel. The word means belonging or dedicated to God. There's a subset of commentaries that sometimes will say maybe that's actually just a nickname for Solomon, but hey, could be just somebody's name. And the real author, though, is his mother. This is the utterance which was taught. Remember, we said in chapter 30 and verse 1 that points typically to an inspired message. So the real author, of course, would be God. God shared this information somehow with the mother of Lemuel, and Lemuel, is writing it, of course, by inspiration, but ultimately, whether this was spoken first or written second, it was guided by God in the origin. So some lessons that are taught to Lemuel. First of all, things that he must avoid. Verse 2, what, my son? What, son of my vows? A son of my womb and son of my vows? Do not give your strength to women, nor your ways to that which destroys kings. So don't allow romantic relationships be your undoing. Solomon certainly needed that message, right? But then there's this interesting lesson here that sometimes is overlooked. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes intoxicating drink. So don't be a person who engages in drinking alcohol. Why? Because you will drink and forget law. You will pervert the justice of all the afflicted. Before alcohol takes, your ability to walk in a straight line, or your ability to touch your nose or anything like that, it takes from you your judgment. And so Lemuel's mother says, don't drink the stuff because you don't want your judgment taken from you. Now, it says in verse 6, give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to him who is bitter of heart. Sometimes people think that this is like a medicinal application, but actually it's a mother talking to her son and saying, on the one hand, it's not for kings. On the other hand, it is for these people. So who is wine for? Not for kings, but for losers. So to drink alcohol is to be, biblically speaking, a loser, a person who is perishing, a person who is bitter of heart. And verse 7 gives you insight into that being really the way we're to understand that. It says, let him drink and forget his poverty and remember his misery no more. You will not forget your poverty simply by drinking. You will drink yourself into further poverty. You will wake up from the alcohol and you'll still be poor. You'll still be miserable. So effectively, again, the lesson isn't that wine is to be medicinally used for these kinds of people. No, instead, drugs are for losers is the simple message of the mom to her son. But on top of that, these are some things that Lemuel must do. Open your mouth for the speechless and the cause of all who are appointed to die. Open your mouth, judge righteously, plead for the cause of the poor and the needy. So he needs to be a person who champions the cause of those who are impoverished. Then, number 3, what Lemuel must find in a wife. There is a question as to whether verses 10 through 31 are a continuance of this message from Lemuel, and I think it is. I think it's a part of the same text, same context, and it makes sense for a mother to teach this to her son, and it's an interesting way, if this is indeed what she taught to her son, that she did so. She actually taught using an acrostic. The verses that follow each begin with a different Hebrew letter, and the Hebrew letters form the words of the alphabet, the letters of the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet. And and so basically, it's like, what do you want to look for in a woman? You need to find a woman who's A, admirable, B, beautiful, C, whatever. I mean, if we were to do something like that. And so, well, of course, I said beautiful, but then charm is deceitful and beauty is passing, verse 30. So inner beauty. But anyway, never mind. I'm not the one making this acrostic. It's Lemuel's mother who did so. So let's talk about the acrostic, which we sometimes identify as a text describing the virtuous woman. What do we know about this virtuous woman? Well, we first of all know about her, how she is to her husband. Who can find a virtuous wife? Verse 10, her worth is far above rubies. And so the husband who finds her has found something truly valuable. His heart can safely trust with her, so he will have no need of gain, literally no need of spoil, no need of having to go out and fight battles to get more money, because she is thrifty and industrious, as we're going to find. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. That's the virtuous woman to her husband. Now to her, in regards to her work. Verse 13, she's a willing worker with her hands. She is also someone who is like the merchant ships bringing her food from afar. I picture the woman who doesn't just go to one grocery store to bring food into her home. She is trying to get the best deals and the best produce for her family, and so she's going from store to store to store and bringing all these things even from afar into her home. And that may be the modern virtuous woman, so to speak. She gets up while it's still night, provides for her household, and even a portion for her maidservants. She's serving the servants. And so there's nothing wrong with serving, to connect this with our message from Agar in the previous chapter. She serves the servants. She also, again, has thrift and wisdom in using money. She considers a field and buys it. For her profits, she plants a vineyard. She girds herself with strength, strengthens her arms. She perceives that her merchandise is good, and her lamp does not go out by night. You obviously do all of this long enough, and your candle's going to burn out. You can't burn the candle at both ends. She's getting up early, she's staying up late. But I think the picture here is of someone who does what's needed when it's needed. And again, she's a willing and able worker. She stretches out her hands to the distaff. Her hands hold the spindle. You see various indications that she gets the raw material and turns it into finished products. And so very industrious and knowledgeable and wise woman. But what does she ultimately produce? Well, good things, as we're going to find, and good behaviors as well. Extends her hand to the poor as she reaches her hands to the needy. Verse 20, so she's generous. She's not afraid of snow for her household, because they're all clothed, and not only clothed, but clothed well. It says with scarlet. She makes herself tapestry for herself. Her clothing is fine linen. She clothes herself well as well. Her husband is known in the gates when he sees among the elders. By the way, when you talk about clothing, being linen and purple, and you're like, well, the rich man wore purple, didn't he? That's a fine garment. But remember, when you're thinking about this, both to find it in immediate context and in broader biblical context, later on, we're going to find that, she wears strength and and honor, right? So it's not just about having fancy clothing, and then strength and honor are clothing, verse 25. But then in the New Testament, let the apparel be the adorning of the heart rather than the outward apparel. 1 Timothy chapter 2. So again, just think about this proverbially, as we've been encouraging ourselves to do. So continuing to read here, her husband is known on the gates, and so she produces a positive reputation for her husband. Verse 23, she makes linen garments, sells them, and so she's industrious in the context of the home. The stay-at-home mom is kind of this interesting thing that is a fashion of the Western and modern world. In the ancient world, the home was a place of economic activity, and every person worked in that economic activity and contributed to it in some way. There weren't any people who weren't doing so. Now, it's perfectly fine for someone to be a stay-at-home mom as such, or if that's the way to add to the needed activity of the family. But let's not condemn the mother who chooses to have a cottage industry or something like that, because that is exactly what's in line with the text here. A person who's using their talents and abilities to increase the economic output of the family, and to provide for the family. Verse 25, strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and her tongue is the law of kindness, and so her produce in terms of speech is also good. As seen by those in her household, in verses 27 through 29, she watches over the ways of her household, not lazy. Her children call her blessed. Her husband praises her, saying, many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. And the conclusion of the text is that she is therefore given praise and ought to be. In verse 30, charm is deceitful and beauty is passing, but as a woman who fears the Lord, she is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. So find that kind of woman, Lemuel. And those of us who might be unmarried, this is the person first that we want to be, and then second, the person that we want to find. And those two things are not unrelated. Well, I did rush through that, and this video is going to be signing off a little bit early, so hopefully you won't mind that too much, but just had a very narrow window of time to try to record all of this. But I want to encourage you to continue your study of the Proverbs, continue to reflect upon its richness, and I know you'll be blessed by doing that. And so if you have any questions over anything that we've covered, feel free to reach out to me. If you have any Proverbs as you read through the book that you really want me to talk about, we don't always have to do that in class. You can feel free to write me and ask me a question, and I would love to hear from you. So with that being said, let's go ahead and close out with a word of prayer. Most holy God, we thank you for the time that we've been able to spend together reflecting upon the truths of the Proverbs. We thank you, Father, for the opportunity to study from the standpoint of the topics that we find on display in chapters 10 through 29, but then also to move through chapters 30 and 31 and the words of Agur and Lemuel. Father, we pray that you will help us to take this information, to apply it to our lives, and be given opportunities to teach it to others. We thank you for the opportunity that we've had, and we offer this in Jesus' holy name. Amen. Well, thank you so much, and that will be it for now, and we look forward to our next occasion where we can meet live once again. God bless you.